Welcome to PetroNerds Podcast, episode 13. It is Thursday, April 29th, 2021. It's the eve of ExxonMobil and Chevron earnings.
It is.
Today we are going to talk about a bunch of good stuff. Oil prices as usual and some high forecasts. OPEC Plus, Biden's recent speech, and China references. U.S. oil demand, a long hearing on U.S. oil and gas
Yes.
on federal lands that both Trisha and I sat through, so you don't have to. The BP earnings call, and our favorite Mohammad bin Salman, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, gave a very long interview with lots to talk about. As always, we are here with our main host, Trisha Curtis, CEO of PetroNerds, and my friend. Good to see you, Trisha.
Good to see you too. Is it nice to be back to you, like giving that intro so that sweet Guinness voice is back in this mix here?
Yes. Well, I mean, I didn't get here because I'm smart, Trisha.
You're really missed at the crawfish boil. Everybody. So it was really cool to be like, hey, PetroNerds. And everybody's looking at me and slapping me on the back, hey, PetroNerd. And then they're like, is Ethan here? Where's Ethan? So you were very missed.
Well, that's good to hear. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And your voice was talked about a lot. Quite a bit.
That's great. Let's get into some real stuff that people want to hear about, though.
Absolutely. So, so oil prices, I mean, we're hanging out. Obviously, oil prices look decent. We're around $64 a barrel. Everything's looking great. I mean, we've been hanging out at the 60 level. We've talked about this at length. OPEC Plus, it was kind of muted. I mean, they didn't say much. They didn't actually do much. They just came out and said, hey, we're going to keep things steady, which we kind of assumed because last month they said they were going to add 2 million barrels a day back over the course of 3 months. So this is basically through from this in April or at the end of March. So this is April, May, June, July. So by July, we should have another 2 million barrels a day back on the market. We'll need to look at the OPEC figures that come out this month or come out in May, and we'll need to see the IEA figures to see what the data actually look like. But I think they'll add these barrels back, and I think that the market's probably going to handle it just fine.
All right, come out of the granular stuff and get big picture. Your thesis on global oil prices on average for the next 18 months.
You keep pushing me on this, but I think we have to get back to this whole, Goldman says it's going to be 80. You know, they think 80 like ASAP. You saw the forecast people. I was watching Bloomberg 2 nights ago, like midnight, and I heard $11,000 copper prices, $12,000 copper, $15,000 copper prices. It was like a bidding war.
It's like being in an auction with Chuck.
Yeah. Everything keeps going up in price. Goldman goes up. Oh, and somebody, I can't remember what the forecast was that said oil demand was going to hit over 101 million barrels per day this year. Now, I think it's really interesting because only a couple months ago, even a month ago, we're sitting here and all the forecasts for IEA and BP and everything are saying we're 95 million barrels a day all year. You know, we're not going to recover. So all of a sudden we're recovering. And part of this is driven, and I do think it is the U.S. perspective, is that oil demand is like 20 million barrels a day. So product demand. We have not fully recovered gasoline demand, but we're getting close. And jet fuel demand is damn sure picked up in the U.S. Like DIA is packed when you go into, like, the airports are busy. Like, people are definitely flying.
But international air travel is still down.
Still down.
And
absolutely.
we're still down global demand year on year, another 5 million barrels a day, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the India situation, so in terms of just like how the market's viewing it, it's that India's in lockdown, and that's a few hundred, at least a few 100,000 barrels a day that's being immediately constrained, and probably more. And then therefore your growth trajectory out of India is probably off. But they'll probably go through this wave, and they need to get these vaccines in place. And I think they'll start opening up at some point. It's really bad there right now, so I don't want to underplay that at all. It
all
doesn't.
Right, but I want to get you back to the punchline, which is that are people calling for 80 too aggressive or not?
Well, I think production comes with it. Because if you look at, I mean, I know we don't have that many rigs running in the U.S., but we've got over 500 rigs running, right? So I just don't see exactly how, everybody thinks, and we'll get to Mohammad bin Salman's comments about the U.S. declining production.
Bonkers.
A million barrels a day every year for the next 10 years. Every country apparently in the world is doing that also.
Right.
There's 2 countries I'm not going to be allowed to go to, and that's going to be Saudi Arabia and China. So those are now going to be off my list probably with this criticism. But so I think, could we spike to 80? Given the market right now, absolutely. Especially with these barrels offline. So if demand was to go crazy and we saw the UK open up, and we have heard that, I guess it looks like Europe is going to allow Americans that are vaccinated to come over. They're going to open up for tourism, even though some of them are still in lockdown right now. So that means that the air traffic is expected to open up sort of like July, right? People are going to be flying abroad. So I think in that time period, if we haven't seen those OPEC barrels come back and you're surging demand, I just don't think you're going to see jet fuel demand go through the roof just yet. It's going to take a while for all that to come into play. Traders may bed that up. You could see 80 for a minute. But if it's sustained, if you have sustained high oil prices, production is going to come back with it. Everybody's going to produce. And OPEC, they won't be satisfied. Those countries are not going to be satisfied with a 2 million barrel a day addition. They're going to want to bring the other barrels
Just
back.
to be clear, you're not saying U.S. rig count is going to go through the roof because it's with or without the U.S. We'll either get OPEC quotas increase or OPEC cheating, but either way, you get production to fill that gap.
Yes, I think, well, easily, it's very, very hard to paint a picture of sustained. So Goldman and all these people putting these price tags on everything, how long is it going to be there? Tell me how long prices will be there. And I want to know the trajectory. Don't just say we're going to hit 80 or we're going to hit 100. Tell me how does it get there? And what happens with supply and demand in those sense? They don't want to talk about that. They just want to put a number out there and they want to get all these hits on it. Well, traders can bid up anything, $5 as we've talked about a lot, either way, even $7 either way. But underlying fundamentals have to be there. And I think that you have 1.5 million barrels a day that could come back on Iran. We're already adding those barrels back. Libya's swinging. And you have several, at least, even after Saudi Arabia brings those barrels back and you bring the 2 million barrels a day or the 1 million barrel a day back that they're allowing for the rest of OPEC plus, you've got 6 million barrels a day sitting there. And by the way, Russia, again, not against Mohammed bin Salman, but I think he's wrong here on Russia, they do have spare capacity as well. Remember that everybody was producing like 11 million barrels a day and change in 2018. I mean, it's not going to be that hard and remember what they were producing in March when prices were in April when they tanked prices. I mean, Saudi Arabia and Russia could go to 12 million barrels a day. It would take a little work quickly, but they could do it. So I'm just saying and all those other barrels that are sitting on the sidelines, they want to come back, especially these prices, because everybody's recovering so well. Their economies are recovering. Their fiscal balances look better. This is why he did that interview. And when all we heard on the market that night when he first did it was that, they want to sell a stake of the pipeline. Of course they do. Why wouldn't you want to sell a stake of your pipeline right now? I mean,
and they're not the only ones. We've also got a couple other OPEC countries selling. I think it's UAE and Oman are also selling assets.
Stakes in pipeline. I mean, I need to dig into those a little bit.
Yeah, it's energy assets across the board. So you don't do that at the bottom.
No, you don't do that at the bottom. And this is the timing is good. And you have to remember, this is no different than where we're at, the pain that they were in and what they experienced and what they saw. And I think it's really important to realize that this is a time for them to recover. So if we didn't have all those barrels that weren't being produced and we still had this level of demand, we've kind of explained it before in previous podcasts, I think that those price spikes, the sustained price spikes, would be more likely. I just can't see production. And I'm not saying the rig count goes crazy in the U.S. It certainly, if you don't think the rig count is going to continue to move up, if oil prices hit 80, you're outside your mind. It's going to continue to move up in the U.S. No, right. Sorry, Chuck Yates and David Ramsden Wood, but whether it should or not, it's going to.
Yes, whether it should or not, at $80, almost everybody's assessments, except the most pessimistic people, are that definitely overcomes the marginal cost of production for even secondary and tertiary PUDs in the U.S. for sure. And
I think what people also have to realize, and this is something that I have spent a little bit of time in the past couple of weeks looking at, is that there are certainly pains that are happening within the U.S. and we've touched on the service sector a little bit, but in the rig count and the frac spread are not matching up. So we used to be able to you had a rig count and you could basically do a division by 3 or whatever and be like, that's how many frac spreads we need. And this is what we need for this production. We'll see what Liberty Oilfield Services is on their earnings call. But the problem is,
I think they had it.
Did they just have it? Yeah. I missed it. Sorry, I have not caught up on that yet.
Yeah, they did, and it rallied pretty hard.
I will be going to that in detail and other earnings call in the next podcast. But we're relatively focused on this one. So there's a couple things, and I don't know what they said on in terms of frac spreads, and they probably didn't tell us how much they're using and how much they have sitting on the sidelines. But I know that there's a lot of companies that basically have a couple dedicated crews, big companies in the Permian that might have a couple dedicated crews, and then they have like the one-offs, right? They're just using a frac crew they're not using for sustained stuff, and that's a decent amount. And the problem with that is that you can't raise prices and you don't have the tightness that you need in the Permian or elsewhere for the service sector to actually raise prices. And I assume it's happening. It's going to. And especially if prices are to go up and we're adding rigs, you're going to see there's going to be repricing in the rigs and there's going to be repricing on the frac spreads. But I don't think what I'm saying is frac fleets out there today are not fully utilized. And therefore, if you're not fully utilized, I don't think you can command the prices that you want.
Yeah, so shout out to Chris Wright. It was a very good quarter. They doubled their FactSet EBITDA consensus. So that was a pretty nice beat. Stock was up 12%. They said, buoyed by worldwide vaccine distribution campaigns together with fiscal and monetary stimulus, global economic growth expectations are increasingly more constructive. So they basically say that frac activity is at maintenance levels. So that's really good. And they are they have captured a decent amount of market share. Obviously they bought Schlumberger, so have the one some. But even then I would just caution a little bit in just saying look, I don't think all of the maintenance levels, but certainly all the Schlumberger frac crews that they had and all the frac spreads or frac fleets and all their frac fleets are not being fully utilized right now. Because you just don't, not 100% utilized, and that you have a chunk of the market in the Permian Basin that's not fully using them. They don't have dedicated frac crews that are just going like crazy. And we're watching the well additions closely. So, sort of stay tuned for seeing where production and that goes. But I do think that we are adding wells and we're adding rig. You can't continue to add the rig count and expect that production is going to stay flat. It is going to eke up. And that was another. Mohammed bin Salman said we're at 10 million barrels per day. We're producing 11 million barrels per day. Are you going to skip ahead to that? I thought we were going to do that at the end.
We're going to do that at the end.
Right,
I just can't help myself because there's things. That being said, we still have over 1,000. We have like 1,200 stacked rigs in the U.S. I just think that's important to point out. It's a lot. So we're over 500 rigs total in the U.S., but we still have a lot stacked. So
I'm still concerned about the ability to pull staffing back in to execute that, because we've punished some people in the last year and made them move elsewhere. And you can see the demographic changes within Texas, for example, with I think Odessa lost some people to some cities. So clearly some pain there. And it may be that service cost inflation has to accommodate, paying people to get them back to the rigs.
Well, and I think this kind of gets into this frac spread thing I'm commenting, is that everybody's trying to be so efficient with what they have. So, you're seeing rigs drill longer laterals, and you're seeing everybody's trying to eke out more with less. And so that goes to people too. And so then when demand ramps up, you will literally have less, and things are going, and I think there's tightness in facets of this already. So we're going to get to a point where things get stickier than they are, and you won't have enough. It'll come back. You pay people enough and they're going to come back to work. So this is a boom and bust industry. I always tell people this, but I grew up around it my entire life, and it is boom and bust. And this is, while it's very, very different than in previous busts, this happens,
Well, I will raise my hand and say that the financial side of the business is certainly boom and bust as well.
It is. It's painful.
So that seems like a natural segue. Let's move on to
natural segue. Yes.
The hearing on federal oil and gas leasing.
Hold on. We're going back to.
Oh, here we go.
I know. We didn't finish the Biden speech and the oil demand.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go.
I want to wrap this. So just wrapping this up on oil demand inflation, I think we definitely have, Powell's keeping things flat. Still sticking with quantitative easing and asset purchasing, which is a little bit shocking. And, Jim Cramer must be smoking something every morning when he wakes up, because he says that there just isn't inflation. It's very segmented. If you have inflation in food, you have inflation. So the countries around the world, developing countries, are saying they have food inflation. So if you have food inflation, it's called real inflation. That's just not, it's not just oil and it's not just copper. There's real inflation out there. So it's not just lumber, that all these things are very real. So I think that although Powell's saying it's going to be short term and it's going to subside. So that's why he's basically saying things are going to be okay. I think that is teeing ourselves up for some problems. And if oil prices continue to climb, as Goldman and everybody says, especially if we were to hit 80, that would be very, very messy. It's going to take that inflation thing and skyrocket. But that hasn't quite happened yet.
Well, and I'm sure that anybody who's out there actually working now is seeing the price of motor fuels as an impact on their business.
Yeah.
I mean, it matters now.
You're going to see it. And as you know, we were talking before, offline before this started. I mean, there's several articles Bloomberg's had on just the demand growth in the used auto sales are growing. So, I mean, the used auto market is huge. So if you have a used vehicle, and I mean, you could sell it for a lot of money, and traffic is up everywhere. So traffic is up everywhere. And this is part of the whole demand story, is because people don't want to take public transportation. And so we are actually seeing higher traffic in certain places than pre-COVID, because as people are trying to get back to do things, they don't want to take public transportation.
I would have gotten to your house for this podcast today a lot quicker had I been on the train than in my car.
Yes.
For sure.
Yeah. This is why he comes to me now. And I don't even have a vehicle that's licensed to come to you. So, but yes, that's very true. So anyways, that's all bullish for oil demand. But Biden's had this speech last night. If you watched it, that it was also basically wasn't a State of the Union, because it's technically his first address to both sides of Congress. It basically was a State of the Union. It was a sub 2 hours, but it was pretty long. And it was very similar to the other ones. I mean, it was basically he was pitching another $2 trillion package. Shocking. Oh, we love these twos. So we did the $2 trillion stimulus package. We have this $2 trillion, infrastructure plan, and now we've got another $2 trillion family plan. So we're at $6 trillion, although $4 trillion of that is not going to be going to the deficit. It's going to be taxed. But it's only going to be taxed. And I am being lippy here, because somebody it has to be okay to criticize this guy, and you can be a little funny with it too.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate and say that it's not just. So let's say the Democrats tax and spend, classic.
Yeah.
The Republicans deficit and spend.
Totally true.
Classic.
Basically,
centralized governments spend a lot of money.
Yes. Very true. And seriously, I mean, you could say Trump got so much flack for cutting taxes and lots of criticism and everything. I just think it's also fair to give Biden plenty of flack, because this is what we are seeing within these things are very, very progressive. So we're talking about free preschool. We're talking about free community college, and
free at the point of purchase.
Yeah. Well, it's just the point is that, and I'm not saying those are bad. Preschool it's a good thing. And community colleges, all these things are good things, but somebody has to pay for them. And I am definitely fiscally conservative. And you can't just assume that, the way he positions this, he didn't talk about who was really going to pay for it. He said that it wouldn't increase the deficit, and that it would only impact 0.3% of the population. And if you weren't making over $400,000, you weren't going to feel it. Well, America is based on a lot of people wanting to make more than $400,000. There's a goal in some people's lives to get ahead of that. And it's interesting, because if you listen to, and I tweeted this.
We are all temporarily dispossessed millionaires.
Yeah. Well, if you listen to the Potomac review, and I didn't mean to tweet I didn't even realize I do not listen to a lot of conservative stuff, because I don't like being told how to
Because you don't need reinforcement.
Well, I mean, I just like making my opinion. I like listening to more liberal stuff, so I can make sure I'm thinking about things correctly. But so the Potomac review, there were just the comments, and the folks on it were explaining the whole tax break. And they did explain that they were thinking of going after S-Corps, which before they weren't going to go after S-Corps. Most LLCs are S-Corps for a number of reasons, and LLCs are your small businesses. So this whole we're not going after small businesses or only 400,000, that's a lie. You're going after...
Okay, so bring this back to the energy market for our listeners, please.
I'm bringing it back to the energy market, because I think this all comes back to, you can't spend this money without having either you have to pay for it some way, or you have to have inflation. And this whole federal hearing, or this hearing on federal oil and gas leasing, which we'll get to, that was a lot about money. That was how much money these states were losing, and how much money maybe they were going to increase with royalties, and we'll get to that in a second. But the point is that you can't have these infrastructure plans green or not green. They have to be. You have to pay for it somehow. And this one is the family plan, but it's interwoven with charging stations and everything, which you talked about, and these China references. This is why I want to talk about this. So every speech he talks about China and it being a thread that we're fighting, that China is saying that democracy won't work. And so we have to prove China wrong, that democracy does work. And I don't like it. I really don't like, one, allowing China to be able to have that influence on us, to be able to say that. And one, you're basically saying that they're right by even explaining it, saying, China says this, so we need to prove them wrong. Well, democracy, when China talks about democracy, and they do use those words, or rule of law, they mean it completely differently. Like, they don't have rule of law, and they don't have democracy in the same way as we do. And when they criticize it, they criticize basically that we can't get things done. There's a reason why, because you can't just push things through. through, we do have democracy. And I think it's very hypocritical for Biden to pass, as many executive orders as he has passed, and then to talk about democracy and to be standing in front of Congress explaining that. Like, if you really wanted it to be democratic, you would have put that stuff forward in front of Congress to do it, but you didn't think it was going to pass because it's so intense. It is so serious. That is very like China. That is extremely autocratic. And I'm not saying Trump did a ton of that. Previous presidents have done tons of executive orders. So that's something that we do now, but it doesn't make it okay. And it doesn't mean that it is democratic in any fashion. And it's not okay to reference China when you want to, and then not reference them when you don't. But it's also, I was listening to a podcast today, and it was Elizabeth Economy, who I've referenced this book, The Third Revolution, and she's talking about Xi Jinping. And she explains really clearly in this recent podcast on the China chessboard with CSIS, and she explains really clearly that, China is a perfect example of, they do have the biggest electric auto market. So people reference this, in the green community, they reference it a lot, is that our lunch is being eaten, and Biden is too, by China because they own the electric car market. They have the biggest one because they also have the largest population. It is not the best one. Like, they don't have Tesla. They're just getting Tesla, and they're like, we have Tesla. It is a superior technology. As much as I like some things by Elon Musk and don't like other ones, it is a superior battery. They do not have that in China. It is a massively fraudulent system. It is top down. And if you want an example of where it can go wrong, of how not to do it, that's it. So don't top down this. So when people are referencing China and thinking about this, the way it's faulted because it is top down innovation, which is not innovation. It's just the government telling me it's riddled with corruption and subsidies, and those subsidies have caused massive corruption. So it's just not a really efficient and working system. There's a reason why they still consume the amount of oil that they consume today, and they import all that crude oil because that whole electric vehicle system hasn't actually worked, to the extent that we think it has in practice.
Well, you guys didn't know that Trisha was going to channel Kyle Bass today, but I didn't either, so that's good. So I'm trying to get Trisha to move to Wyoming, and not because I don't like her in Denver, but because I think she needs to run for Congress, so because she could just rant and rave for an hour, and I think she'd do well.
I would be happy to take on AOC in a debate.
One really interesting thing that there's an author and a consultant who I think is fairly appreciated, but had a point this week that has been missed by the mainstream, as far as I can tell. Peter Zion, who talked about data coming out of China, which suggests that their population has peaked, which I find fascinating for a number of reasons, because it's this big giant market, and the prior expectation was that their population was peaking in 2030s sometime, and apparently that's been pulled forward either because of more COVID deaths or because their birth rate is declining, or some combination thereof. I think it has fascinating implications for the broader market, geopolitical implications. I was talking to my friend who's a Commodore in the Navy about this. He was, running ships in the South China Sea to help security in the region. But if indeed China's population is declining, we're still going to get increased energy intensity, but the absence of that population growth has a big impact on energy demand forecasts.
Yes, and it's a really great point. And I'm glad you brought it. Well,
occasionally I do make one.
You make really good points. And I'm glad you brought it to that, because I saw the same note, and the other podcast I listened today was, Elizabeth Economy was explaining that, basically that they have peaked. So I don't know if you saw that China did come out and they debunked that. And they said, no, our population is still increasing. Of course, they're going to say that. So they're going to have to say that, because that's part of the whole trajectory, and they don't want things looking bad. They have changed their policy from one child to a two-child policy, but it hasn't changed everything. And the divorce rate's high. And people are becoming educated. When you educate women, when people make more money, it sort of naturally declines. It does have implications for long-run growth trajectory, I think, for oil demand. Not as much, I think, for energy is a little bit different, because as we've noticed, and this comes back to the Biden speech a little bit, but everyone keeps referencing, their ability to build transmission lines and everything, and how sophisticated it is. Again, it is not that sophisticated when it's 65% coal. And people always reference, you hear a lot of you hear a lot of conservative podcasts and people saying, oh my gosh, 60% coal and it's all coal. They're building new coal-fired power plants. They are. There's a website, just Google it. Google Chinese coal-fired power plants. You can see actually every single one that's in existence, all the new ones that are permitted, all the ones that are in construction, and the new ones that are, so the ones,
I actually think that's Michael Bloomberg's website that tracks it.
It's the energy, it's the carbon tracker. It's a tracker website, maps all of it. It's awesome to look at. This isn't fiction, people. We're talking dozens and dozens of power plants that are on. And the reason they're doing that, as we've mentioned before, is, and the reason they're probably less efficient is because they're building them for peak loads, right? So they're not using all of them all the time at full capacity, which is worse because then they become more inefficient, and then you're only building them to your peak loads and your peak demand of everything, which means they're going to have the power, but you're going to have more emissions, and they're just not going to be nearly as efficient. So when Biden last week did the whole emissions agreement with China, and this is important to think about, is that they said, oh yeah, we're in agreement. It was nothing formal, right? They just said that they were in agreement. Of course they're going to say that. They have every incentive to, and this is where you have to do enough research on China to understand how they want to be a part of the order of the world, how they want to literally run the rule structure and global governance. So of course they're going to engage in those dialogues and say, yes, we're going to contribute to this. We're going to do it. Doesn't mean they're going to actually do anything. I mean, you would have to concretely lay things out to say that you're going to do something. So you have to basically play the part and agree to it, and maybe do some things, little things here at home, tinker around, and he's building electric cars and all that stuff. But it doesn't mean that it's sincere, because the most important thing for him is maintaining power, and his regime is really about not just power internally, but it's externally and projecting that. And they are projecting that power. So, and that's going to take energy. And if it means fighting emissions or it means consuming energy and projecting that power, you can bet your ass it's going to be consuming energy and projecting that power.
Well, I unequivocally believe that the Chinese are taking us for a ride, and they're going to do exactly what suits their interests. And any assumption other than that is just naive. So it came out this week that the Chinese are going to buy a 1% stake in Aramco through maybe one of their vehicles. They haven't determined exactly which one, but that's the news.
That's
so
the one that,
a $20 billion stake. Yeah. They have a bilateral agreement with the Iranians, which is undercutting our foreign policy. So they are getting their posture in the Middle East squared away while we are basically getting our ass handed to us. That's the way I see it. Yeah,
and I mean, if you look at their role in the Middle East over time, and we've kind of explained this before, but you have to look at the Chinese strategy is very all hands on deck, sort of do everything and then use what works later. Mm-hmm. And that this was before Xi Jinping. It wasn't.
And you wrote your thesis on that, right?
I did write my thesis on that, my dissertation on it. So I think that I listened to 2 podcasts today that I thought were interesting, because it's a paper that I'm really excited to read on decoding when China talks about rule of law, or when China talks about democracy, that they don't mean the same things. Literally, they don't mean the same things, because rule of law in China is literally means that rule of law is beholden to the Communist Party. So the Communist Party sets that is the game, set, match. So if the Communist Party says they're going to do something, nobody can challenge that. So it's very, very different. So when I think the guy on the CSIS podcast was asking Elizabeth Economy, why didn't we see Xi Jinping coming? Why didn't we see this sort of authoritarian nature? And she kind of balked at it and just said, no one could have. And he was like, really? And I thought, really? I mean, I didn't say I didn't predict in college that Xi Jinping was coming, but there was nothing about China's strategy even before him that was super peaceful. I mean, you had to want to believe that, and you could see it in the literature and everything, but you had to really want to believe that it was a very, very peaceful rise. And now there was an option for that. There was a more sort of liberal order that could have happened. It was 50-50. And now with Xi Jinping, it's over and done with. I didn't realize that after the meeting in Alaska, they're selling T-shirts in China that were just basically, they don't want to be told what to do. So they're having a very anti-Western vibe now. And I'm sure that's not everyone, but it's a real thing that's happening in China. And so they just don't like the West getting involved and telling them what to do. And Xi Jinping has done a really good job, the way Mohammed bin Salman and Putin do it as well, of basically whenever we say anything or whenever anything happens to China, they're just well, this is the West, and this is just the West manipulating us. So, we want to do this stuff in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is ours, and this is just the West trying to get involved and intervene. And it's well, no, you're changing every rule in Hong Kong to where there is no elections. You've taken out all the books on democracy out of the libraries, and now you're changing the rule to where dissidents, you're going to be able to take them back to China and imprison them. So, I mean, this is just what's happening. And then everybody on these podcasts, these scholars of China are like, they kind of joke. It's a little sad about Taiwan, but they're like, well, they haven't taken over Taiwan yet. And you're like, yet? Like it's impending. Like
it's imminent.
It's imminent. Like,
well, all you need to know about China is 3 things. Number 1, on TikTok, you can't mention the Tiananmen Square massacre. So the people on TikTok call it the Cinnamon Square massacre. So they're using code words and posting.
And I'm sure that gets
Tank Man, which is one of the biggest symbols of political freedom ever, which most people in China probably haven't ever seen because it's suppressed by the media. The second is that you can't buy a house in the U.S., or if you can, you got to pay 20% over ask. Where's the housing inventory available? Hong Kong.
Yep.
There's a lot of houses for sale in Hong Kong.
I'm sure there are a lot of houses for sale in Hong Kong. I think it's one of these things that people think is, people think you can go down a lot of different levels of research, and it doesn't get much better. Like, it's not like the theories get better. So it's really important to think of China in the context of how we think about energy. And this is what I liked about both these podcasts, is both these scholars were explaining, like, and especially Elizabeth Economy, was that you can't have both. I mean, she was very appreciative of Biden's policy so far on China, and she liked all of it, except she said you cannot dissect climate policy and something else. It is no like, hey, we'll work with you on this, but on this other stuff, let's keep the climate thing going and we'll work with you on this. You can't. And I come back to this because the world is getting 80% of their solar panels from China. We know that 50% of them are coming from Xinjiang. We know that Xinjiang it's not just forced labor, but we know these are probably concentration camps, and Lord only knows what else is going on there. So this is a time for the world to wake up and say, maybe we have to slow down on our imports of solar panels. And already I'm hearing people saying, well, we're just going to make sure they don't come from Xinjiang. Like, but you're okay with them coming from China, and they're doing this? Like, no, it's either you got to stand up for it. And it's not that you have to be anti-solar. It's just that, like, maybe take a pause on that and you pivot to wind a little bit and you figure that out until you can figure it out. Like, these are just going to be the natural things that happen as you're trying to, in this energy transition. If you're trying to do that, you're going to have to be conscientious that if it's coming from China, it's going to be dirty, and dirty in a lot of different ways than just coal.
And scene. All right.
Yep.
So can we move on to U.S. hearing on federal oil and gas leasing now?
Can. I think this is a natural segue.
Oh, yeah. Great. Okay. All right, folks. So bringing her back to reality here. Here we go. Okay.
All right. U.S. hearing on federal oil and gas leasing. So
yes, it was 2.5 hours. We both listened to it separately.
Yes.
It was pretty interesting. There were some sparks.
There were some sparks. I mean, it was long-winded. I thought they echoed a lot of the same things we heard in the first, the hearing, or not the hearing, but the forum that we both listened to on oil and gas leasing. So this was a hearing, and you had Senator Barrasso, Murkowski, Manchin was chairing it, right?
Yes.
So he's chairing it. He seemed to be playing both sides. Like, this is good, this is bad. But the woman from BLM was there.
Not a Wolf Culver.
Yeah, not a Wolf Culver. So a couple things that stuck out to me was that one is the anger from Wyoming, and the anger from the states that were basically feeling the brunt of the impact. So Alaska and Wyoming essentially saying, look, when you freeze oil and gas leasing, because the executive order on climate change, which was referenced a gazillion times, it's referenced by the BLM a lot. This is, I think it's 14008. That executive order on climate change suspended all leasing. So no more leasing on federal land. And they say, well, we are still doing permits, right? So they've actually say they approved 500 permits since January. They did have that moratorium on permits. They have since started approving permits, and I have actually seen that in my data as well. We are seeing permits approved in New Mexico, and there's a lot in the pipeline. Interesting, Vicky Holub, I got to give her some major props on this one, because she did
a great job.
She did. She really did a great job, and I've criticized her, and I know her. She's a nice woman, but I have criticized her publicly in terms of some of the criticizing the purchase and everything of that company. But she did a really great job of saying, when they asked her the hard questions, she answered them. And she did say, somebody had said, is it a change of course on the permitting? And she said, look, we're we've asked for extensions on a lot of permits. And she said it is historically you would get those extensions. That's what would happen. And she said, this does seem like a change of course because we are not getting the extensions. So the point of the extensions on permits, guys, is that you have permits, basically federal permits are 2 years and they expire. So it's not like you can extend them. And I think that's what they're trying to do is folks try to extend these permits.
My biggest issue with the whole thing was Nada Culver acting as if the permitting moratorium did not have any impact on revenue.
Yes.
And I mean, look, the progressive wing of the party has been very clear that they want to end oil and gas leasing, to leave it in the ground, to stop U.S. production. And I don't understand why they don't just own that position and just say, we are trying to suppress oil and gas production.
Because
why are they acting as if that's not the motivation? Just own it.
They don't want to own it because they want to make it very peaceful that, that's not what we're doing. We're not trying to prevent. Well, bullshit. You are. You're trying to penalize. I mean, if you didn't, so they multiple gentlemen, I think, from Wyoming mentioned that you didn't have to actually suspend leasing in order to do this review. And they're absolutely correct in that. So why did they have to stop leasing on federal oil and gas leases and cancel the first and second rounds that we were supposed to have this year, which they were legally binding? So why did they cancel them? Couldn't they have done this review whilst doing those leases? And the point is that Biden wanted to send a signal that they're going after oil and gas production. So, but then they also want to send the signal, they want to tell the American people that they're not actually killing it. So this is what they say. And Culver, she's put in a tight position. Her attitude is not, I'm just reading it as you can see it. It's not favorable to oil and gas. I mean, when she gets a chance to take a shot, she takes it as politically correct as she takes it in the most PC format she can. But when she's asked, and there's a snarkiness to it when she's asked, like, well, they reference 12.5% royalties were set in 1920. All these things were set back then. Yes, they were set then. Could they be higher? Absolutely. But when they talk about leases, like, how much I love it when they talk about the leases that didn't get sold and how they go over the counter for like $1. Well, hello, it's geology. This is oil and gas. You don't buy something that has no value. So yes, somebody might pick that up because, they're going to do enough exploration work. This has happened in the powder. Lots of companies do this. This is kind of natural oil and gas. And by the way, this isn't going to be that different if we ever, look at lithium or we're trying to mine for stuff, they're going to do the same stuff. They're going to pick up these leases. Some of it may be prospective, some of it may not. But the stuff that really is going to get bid up, and they're going to get bonus bids, and they're going to get all kinds of money for it. And I think it was the governor or senator from Wyoming who said, look, even though the royalties are lower, the permitting is harder. So the permitting compliance is harder and more expensive. That's right. Why some of the reasons the royalty is lower. So it's clear that if they do, I mean, it seems to me like they probably let leasing go forward, but in a very restricted fashion. So it's not like you're going to be, if you're in oil and gas, you should be super excited that it's going to get much better. But it seems like they'll let it go forward. Although it's very clear to me that they're going to jack up royalties like crazy because they're going to try to offset what they think they're going to do. From my humble opinion, I think they're going to limit the leasing. They're going to limit it and think that just wherever there's federal land, of course, somebody will want to drill, even though if it's not prospective, they'll limit the leasing. They'll jack up the prices. They'll increase the bonus bids. They'll jack up the royalty rates, and no one's going to
raise the bonding.
Yeah, and no one's going to do it. So they're not going to get the money they need. And they did explain that it is the water and conservation, the wildlife fund is 100%. Our conservation wildlife fund is 100% exclusively paid for by federal oil and gas leases and offshore. So there's a lot of money, hundreds of millions that go into Wyoming. And what was his numbers? Senator Brasso and the governor were mentioning numbers that. Well,
I think they said $4.2 billion for the Treasury, half that amount in total, maybe half that amount to the states. I don't recall the exact figures.
It was a few hundred million. It was several.
The numbers for more rural states like Wyoming and Alaska and New Mexico are significant, with New Mexico having 40% of its budget coming from oil and gas activity.
And when you're talking about, I think what they were mentioning on the leasing, and I think it's important to think about this, is that it's a scary freeze to states like Alaska and states like Alaska and Wyoming and New Mexico, because you're sending a signal to oil and gas that you're not going to be doing anything. And so much of that revenue is coming from federal land. So if there's no new leases, you're sending a signal to these companies that they're going to need to pivot. And they do. They absolutely are pivoting. No company is sitting here with massive exposure to Wyoming thinking they feel they're in a great position. They're thinking, what the hell are they going to do? And it's business. This is no different than if somebody said, look, you're not going to be your solar company and you're not going to be able to get your solar panels for the next 2 years from China. You're going to be freaking out. What are you going to do? Or you're going to say, we're going to take a pause on leasing on wind land, on where you're going to put that on just the leasing of the land. We're going to take a pause. We don't know when we're going to stop that pause, but we got to study it. Companies would get nervous. They wouldn't know what to do. This is no different. So it's a pause, but it's indefinite. And they kept asking, Nada Culver, everyone kept asking her, so how much is this costing? And she says, well...
No near-term impacts.
She said, no near-term impacts. And Wyoming's already saying we already have near-term impacts because we've missed lease sales, and those lease sales give us multiple millions. So we already have near-term money that we normally would have. Plus, they've suffered from 2020. So you got to realize that the states feel these impacts. And I know the other side in the environmental community would say, look, but we have to move away from oil and gas. So we eventually got to have to do this. The problem is all of this is going after production. It's not going after consumption. So it drives me bananas because when all these, I didn't even know these numbers, they were like 25%, because the industry people kept saying, it's not 25%. Western Alliance.
It's 1%.
Yeah. So there was emissions. So I guess there was a study, and you probably heard it too, where they explained that a full life cycle study, and it maybe was Nada Culver who explained this, that there was a full life cycle study of emissions that from all the crude oil and natural gas produced on federal land after consumption, so the full life cycle, it was 25% of U.S. emissions, which still I would we probably need to dig into that a little bit more. But the reality so that's full life cycle. That's after combustion and everything. And who knows when that study was actually, I think that was an old 2018 study, maybe older. But the reality is less than 1%. The emissions from production are less than 1%. So, and if you're talking about full life cycle, this is just where it gets really unfair about saying, somebody did mention it. I think it was Murkowski that was saying we're importing more crude oil from Russia
than from Alaska into the lower 48.
And that's crazy. And that there is no carbon tracking life cycle emissions on that shit. So you have to look at the imports we have. And California is known for that because it fits that type of crude fits into the refineries really well. And I knew that California takes in a decent amount of Russian crude because they have the ports and they were never willing to do crude by rail. They didn't want to take in crude by rail into those refineries. But all of that, like Murkowski really laid in hard of, she was intense. I give her some credit too, because she wasn't going to back down at all on this. And she was explaining, I like the way she characterized business, and that, I would love to have an expert on this podcast or somebody talk to us about the intertwining of federal land and Native American land, and how this gets messy, because we heard this in that hearing. We heard this from the tribal communities and on the BLM hearing, that it's not clean. It's not just you 100% have tribal land or you have federal land and it gets interwoven, and in Alaska it clearly does. So she was explaining that basically the National Petroleum Reserve and other portions were also tribal land, and they were not consulted. So basically once they did this freeze on leasing, tribal communities were impacted and there was no consultation, which is in violation of an executive order that was passed in the year 2000.
Well, one of the points on the commingled minerals is where in places like Wyoming, where you have some of the patchwork land grants for the railroads. So the railroads got, it's basically like crosshatch every other section. And then the federal lands were in between that. So if you want to go do a development, by the virtue of the reservoir, you have to have both parties at the table.
Yeah, I just want to talk to an expert who knows where there's actual examples of federal, state, and tribal lands that intertwine, because it does mean that tribal sovereignty, it's like who supersedes that. And I think one of these senators or one of these governors actually also mentioned that, hey, as a royalty owner, because they were explaining the 12.5%, they were saying as a royalty owner, it's not just the freezing of this stuff, you're impacting royalty owners. And royalty owners can be It's not always one entity. So it's not just the federal government who has all those roads. It's not just a private owner or just a tribal owner. They can be mixed. And therefore, that might also be illegal.
Well, I know most of our listeners are probably down in Texas, but a lot of this is a legacy of the actual Trans-Alaska Pipeline deal when they created the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act to basically horse trade to get the taps done. So that's where a lot of this commingled native power and royalty issues in Alaska come from. It's kind of fascinating and unique in the U.S.
Yeah, I still would really like to go up to Alaska, and I think we need to have one of these folks on the podcast and to talk about it.
Well, once you make a ton of money at PetroNerds this year, we'll do a podcast up there and on a fishing boat. How about that?
That sounds great.
We'll go catch the full cycle.
Their production is declining in Alaska. Production is declining in Colorado. Production is declining in Wyoming. Production is declining in Alaska. It's going to continue to decline in California, in all these places. But the comments by who was the gentleman that got mad at the governor of Wyoming for said, well, I can't believe, why did you sue them? Because Wyoming has sued they have sued the administration on the executive order on leasing. And they said, why did you enact confrontation when you could have talked to us about this? And I thought, well, nobody talked to these states before the executive order. There was no consultation with tribal lands. There was no consultation with anyone. The other thing that's interesting is that this did get to your point on that when they banned had the moratorium on permitting, this is intertwined in that really in a weird way. So, we're talking about this banning on leasing. So there is a suspension on all federal oil and gas leasing, onshore and offshore. The ban on the permitting has been lifted, and that was a 60-day moratorium. And it was just kind of like, it seems like it's dirty politics. Like, you just had this acting Secretary of Interior throw this in. You included tribal lands, but that wasn't legal, so you took that out. And then you had this 60-day suspension. Like, why did you do that? Was it to scare people? Was it to show people that you had the power to do it? Was it to manhandle on the politics side? Like, what was the purpose of that?
Well, elections have consequences, and the Republicans better do a better job if they want to not have these government agencies knock down industry.
Well, doesn't this, when I'm thinking about these, so this federal land, doing this stuff federal, I'm thinking about pipelines, and I'm thinking about, well, look, if you want to tweak FERC, you're going to have to do these transmission lines. Biden wants to build, redo all the transmission lines. And, it's harder in a democracy to do that, because in China, you just build it because you bulldoze through people and you don't ask them. The reason we have NIMBY is, and people don't want stuff in the backyard, it is going to be hard to get big transmission projects done. I know that there's some interest in changing some of the regulatory things to do that.
Well, interestingly, just as an aside, the Supreme Court is reviewing, took cert on Penn East Pipeline on eminent domain, which is fascinating because that's been a precedent for, I think, about 80 years. So we'll see if any of that changes. And what's interesting about that is, forget that it's about a pipeline.
This is why I bring this up.
If we want to have renewables power the U.S., the amount of land that would take is extraordinary. And you better believe, to build the transmission and to build thousands and thousands of acres of solar and wind farms, you're going to need eminent domain to execute that.
You will need eminent domain. That was why I brought it up, is so that this really does have implications on the renewable side. And the other piece of it is just that, and increasingly, and this is from, I've been speaking with a lot of folks that are investing in renewables and are investing in oil and gas as well. And people are getting increasingly anxious about just the technical feasibility of these policies, of that in 2030, it's 100% green, clean grid. The technology does not yet exist. So I don't understand how this is like, we're planning for it. We're gonna spend for something for technology that doesn't exist. And I'm not saying it can't exist, that you can't get there, but you have to. It's very hard for people to do the math to say, like, and it's very hard to get people to spend $6 trillion of all this damn spending that you want to spend on something that does not yet exist.
Right. Well, a couple points there. So the first is that I think, technically, is it feasible that we could go power everything off of renewables? A Stanford scientist put out a paper that said, yeah, we could do that. Requires massive investment, but let's just say that you can do that. What I don't hear is anybody saying, let's do that, but yeah, it's going to take our power prices up to German levels. It's going to take 3x. It's very regressive. So we're talking only about the benefits of these kind of things we want to do, but not the costs. And that's the struggle, I think, that, we've seen the yellow vest protests in France when diesel prices get to a certain level that people start to riot. So, if you wanted to truly pass on the costs of carbon, for example, you'd do it at the gas pump and it would say CO2 cost and there'd be a 50-cent line. And the reason that's not going to happen is because politicians will lose their jobs. So when it comes time to pay the piper for this stuff, we'll see. I mean, even Democrat Warren Buffett came out and said, I'm going to spend $8 billion on gas-fired power plants in Texas to solve this power liability problem.
That's where I just say is that I don't see the olive branch coming from. I don't see an olive branch coming from this the administration to say this is how we get, here's how to bring in the industry, here's how to do this. And I hear Biden's speech last night. He said the same thing in every speech of that. When I think climate change, I think jobs, and and I think we're going to build electric. Basically, he sees jobs in building new transmission lines, and he sees jobs in building charging stations.
Well, I could go build a road handing a bunch of people shovels and I'm paying a minimum wage, but that wouldn't be the best or most efficient allocation of capital.
It's just it's just literally like building gas stations and getting all your crude oil from Saudi Arabia and Iran. Like that, no, you can't just build the electric charging stations, and that is needed. You certainly have to. BP talks about in their earnings call. You certainly have to have electric charging stations in order to have EV adoption. I totally get that. If that's your policy and you want to do it, but you're not producing the batteries. So do not lie to the American populace and tell them that you are consuming. I mean, you're actually taking the China route. China typically will not build, the money tech behind the iPhone, and they would slap the sticker on it and then they would sell it. And increasingly they did more and more the components. Well, you don't get the money from
emissions aren't lies though.
I know, but you don't get the money from that. So we're not capturing the value chain, the money piece of all this if we're not making the batteries, and if we're not mining them. And I know that there's been more talk. I think the Secretary of Energy, Granholm, and we can pivot there for just a second because I have to pick a bone here. She has mentioned, wanting to mine for lithium and mine for things in the U.S. I think that's hard. I saw that there's if you look up mines in the U.S., most of them are there's protests for them, right? From environmental communities. The Pebble mine in Alaska, which is a copper mine, to my knowledge. I mean, so I think it's going to be really difficult for a lot of these mines to actually get traction in places like the U.S. I think it could this could be the olive branch to a coal mining communities and other mining communities where you can certainly take that knowledge and they can mine for this stuff. And this isn't just pure grain tech, right? I mean, copper and everything is going into all kinds of technology. So this has cross-pollination. But, some of the comments that our Secretary of Energy, Granholm, has made have been concerning. And when she's talking about line 3 and line 5 I believe it's line 3 for Enbridge. And she's saying, I think she conceded that she doesn't have, she's not going to weigh in on whether or not that pipeline should be there. But she said she wishes that we would be transporting hydrogen in those pipelines instead of crude oil and crude oil products. And I thought, well, honey, hydrogen doesn't just go into, it's a different molecule. So it's a different size molecule. We don't have it in abundance. We have to create it. We have to strip off the oxygen, or we have to strip off the carbon from it. And if you put it in existing pipelines today, it would probably blow up. So you have to create a pipeline system to do that. So I don't know if she just doesn't know what she's talking about, or if she is so intent on it. And she said, we're going to lower the cost of hydrogen by 80%. It is not the cost that's the problem right now. It's that we produce and consume most of it at refineries. It certainly costs a lot because you have to use some form of energy or electricity to make it. So I'm not anti-hydrogen either. I'm just saying if you're trying to use it tomorrow, the system just doesn't exist. It's just that you have to let the tech build up. And I think she's trying to support the things that do it. But you also have to have the network to adopt it. Again, I tell people listen to the two hydrogen podcasts on the Energy Transition podcast. They're really good to actually give you sort of some of the nuts and bolts behind that. But that's my digression from Granholm. I won't even get into her. Yeah,
well, just to follow up, you mentioned the lithium mining. I mean, Nevada is probably the best place to mine in the United States. There's not a huge population density. It's pretty arid, Nevada, right? The Thacker Pass lithium mine that's proposed, people are protesting it. Humboldt County, Nevada. It's not really a better place in the United States to mine lithium for our own use. So, you can't have
It's
fairies and unicorns and rainbows without a little lithium mining.
And you should also this should be the olive branch of the coal community, because they will back you on this. I mean, the coal community would go, I think it was the governor of Wyoming and the senator that said, hey, we have uranium in Wyoming and everything. I mean, they have this stuff. So the mining community, it would certainly be for,
that is ultimately the true test of whether climate is an emergency or not, is someone's position on nuclear power. And we should say adieu to Indian Point, which is shutting down on Friday.
It's shutting down on Friday. This is the New York facility.
Yep.
So this is an interesting one, and we've mentioned this before, but from my knowledge of this is like, so you do have folks on varying spectrums of how they see this nuclear plant facility, and I would say varying views on nuclear within the progressive climate change community, the energy transition community, and folks that really want to move the needle on this, is that a lot of them are not for nuclear. A lot of them are for nuclear. Many of them are just solar and wind, and that's what they want. But this power plant, folks say, well, we should just keep it going. It's been extended 10 years. So I think it's very expensive to keep it going. I don't think it's hard to keep it. The life has been extended a lot than it should be. You do still have and I listen to BBC and I hear them talking about Fukushima still, because Fukushima, they've tapped out the water levels in the plant to hold. So they have to start dumping the water into the ocean, and people are freaking out that they are just now getting people to eat the fish again. And they say it's fine. Well, in Europe, they dump the nuclear water into the ocean as well. So nuclear it's nuclear. It comes with the risks and everything, and you do have to deal with this sort of water, which no one, I guess, really likes to talk about.
Well, it's the safest form of power in terms of mortality, and the concentrations are very low, and we still have this psychological, I mean, you probably saw Chernobyl on HBO. It was like scare tactics up. Yes, it was a horrible accident, but, honestly, the psychology of nuclear is the thing that prevents it, and the overregulation. I mean, so I have no uranium stocks, but if you truly believe that carbon is the ultimate threat to mankind, you should be building nuclear power plants like crazy. I
just don't know if the regulatory, and this is again where the administration will be having to figure out figure out these regulatory things of eminent domain, because we also, and just the air quality standards, right? The reason that it's so hard for a new refinery, we've talked about this, and cars, new, diesel cars to get into the U.S. is we have very stringent NOx and SOx regulations. And so, and just the regulatory burdens and the permitting to build a new nuclear facility, you would have to change everything. And there is some reason why they're doing this oil and gas leasing, because they do want to put a lot of renewables on federal land. And yeah, that's fine. I'm not against putting wind and solar on federal land. Just don't ruin, the landscape of Wyoming. I mean, nobody is going to love driving around a
lot of Wyoming is.
It is, and it's windy. Wyoming is also extremely windy. There are a lot of places that this can totally work. So I get that.
It's not all Jackson Hole.
It's not. Well, Jackson Hole is not Wyoming. Just for the folks of us who are actually from Wyoming, it's not. So. Is this a natural point that you want to?
Oh, I don't know. I was just going to let you keep going, since every time I try to segue, you cut me off. But yes, let's talk about the BP earnings call, please.
Well, we've talked about this U.S. hearing on federal land, and I think with this, given that
digress like crazy into nuclear power.
She
just winds me up so much.
Yeah,
I got to say something. I wouldn't normally rant about that.
This is good. So this is going to be, because there are some things going on within Digital Wildcatters, and they have some time constraints on things. So this is going to be a 2-part episode.
I like how she's throwing Corley and McClellan under the bus here.
This is going to be a 2-part episode, and so we're going to wrap this one up, and we're going to continue to talk about the BP earnings call and the Mohammed bin Salman interview, which is awesome. So
all right, episode 2 coming up later.
Okay.